Okay. And again, this is our Career Insights program. I'm really excited for you all to join us. And I am actually going to kick it off to our moderator for the panel, Kathleen, and they will introduce themselves and get started.
So welcome everybody. I'm so glad that you can make it. I'm Kathleen Taylor. I'm a lecturer in psychology and I am also a clinical psychologist. I was hired by the psychology department specifically to help in beef up our clinical psychology offerings. So I teach classes associated with clinical psychology. I teach the laboratory and clinical psych, but then in addition, I'm also a licensed clinical psychologist and I'm part of a group practice here in Manhattan. My experience is probably very different than many of our panelists. I was actually a neuroscience researcher for 25 years and then returned to school after many years of not being in school, and did a clinical psych respecialization where I got credit for my PhD, but I went back and did all of the clinical courses and the experiential things in order to become licensed. So I've been licensed for, I think, 4 years, coming up on 4 years now, and I see patients in addition to my work teaching. We were very excited to put this panel together and be able to bring some experts, some Barnard alum who are out there working as clinical psychologists who can give you a lot of insights into what it's like to be a clinical psychologist, what it's like to be a clinical researcher, what it takes to follow down this pathway. I'll also mention that I'm also the preclinical advisor in the psychology department. So if you are interested in clinical psychology and you have specific questions you'd like to ask or even just chat about it, you're always welcome to make an appointment with me or stop into my office hours and we can talk about that more. So let me turn this over to the panel and ask them to introduce themselves. Gina, if you want to get us started and tell us a little bit about you.
Yes. Hi, everybody. So my name is Dr. Gina Davis. I'm really excited to be here. Also a little nervous today. I stutter, so you might hear some pauses and repetitions as I speak. So just, thanks in advance for your patience. So a little about me. I am a licensed clinical psychologist in the state of California. I graduated from Barnard with a degree in psychology in 2007. And then afterwards, I came back to California, which is where I'm from, the San Francisco Bay Area. And I obtained my PsyD in clinical psychology. I completed my pre-doctoral internship at the UCSF Trauma Recovery Center in San Francisco, where I worked with victims of violent crime. And then I traveled down to Los Angeles for my postdoctoral fellowship, where I worked at Mount St. Mary's University. And I worked with college and graduate students in their counseling and psychological services department. And then I got licensed in 2014. And in 2015, I opened a private practice, but it didn't really pick up until 2017. So I returned to a full-time job for the county here in the Bay Area, and I worked in the public schools for 5 years. And earlier this year, I transitioned out of my work in the public schools, and I am now full-time private practice.
Fantastic, thank you. Catherine, you want to tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. So I graduated Barnard in '91. I was a double major in psychology and women's studies, which I believe is now called gender studies, and went on after a research assistant position at Columbia to graduate school. And I've spent most of my career pretty much divided. The first half was spent in academic medical centers in departments of psychiatry, on faculty doing primarily research and also clinical work. And my research has always had a clinical focus. And then the second half of my career, I was on faculty in a PhD program in clinical psychology and taught the next generation of clinical psychologists. I retired as a full professor about 1.5 years ago early because I had to move from the East Coast back to Chicago with my family for personal reasons, and joined a center that some colleagues had created that kind of is a hybrid of academia and evidence-based group clinical practice. And I joined them as a director of research and training. So we now have a vibrant training arm. So I still get to teach and also do research, which is very much a part of my passion in the field.
Fantastic. Thank you and welcome. Tali, why don't you tell us a little bit about you?
Sure. So I graduated Barnard in 2014. I was trying to calculate and remember as I was sitting here. I minored in economics and majored in psychology. When I started out Barnard, I was planning on majoring in math and econ, and then math got too hard. I made it through a few courses and then switched gears a little bit. So that's kind of how I ended up majoring in psychology, and then had some experiences while I was in Barnard. Working at the toddler center was one of them. Can't recommend that enough. And then ended up going straight from Barnard to graduate school. And I went to LIU Post for my clinical PsyD and graduated in 2019. Also had to calculate that. I currently work at a group practice in Westchester, New York called Cognitive Behavioral Consultants, where I'm a staff psychologist and research director. So in terms of the research that we do a lot of research in clinical practice. So what that means is evaluating how our clinical services are working. Are they effective? Do they actually meet the goals that we say they do? Good news is most of them do, at least the ones we've been researching thus far. So I can confidently say that our treatment is working. And then from a clinical perspective, like what I do as a psychologist is I specialize in a treatment called dialectical behavior therapy, or DBT, which was initially designed for adults with chronic suicidality or borderline personality disorder, which has now been kind of like downstreamed to, across transdiagnostically across emotional disorders for adults, teenagers, and kids. So that's one thing I do. I also specialize in something called parent-child interaction therapy, or PCIT, which is for little guys with behavior problems. And then also do like general CBT for anxiety and depression, that kind of thing.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that. And finally, Aurelie, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you do?
Thank you. I love hearing all of these stories. I think they're so important to know how we got to where we are. So I'm a graduate too from 1997, had to do that calculus. And I started as a pre-med student and eventually, and psych major, and eventually folded that into a biopsych major because I left the pre-med track and found myself in religious studies as well as a minor. So I combined those two things and I found a clinical program across the street at Teachers College where I got my PhD in the clinical psych program, studying psychospiritual development. And was very interested, particularly, intersected with women's studies as well, and looking at transition to parenthood specifically. So shortly after, I guess I did my all my other training at local hospitals, Elmhurst Hospital. They had an ER and a women's forensic unit, and was hired then by Teachers College, myself also a lecturer and an administrator. So I was the director of the master's program in clinical psychology for a good while, and then transitioned to start up a new institute called the Spirituality Mind Body Institute at Teachers College. And we built that from the ground up. So really thinking about curriculum and how do we train, as someone else said, the next generation. And just last year, I'm pleased to say I found funding for my own research, and I transitioned to now a new role. So research professor, and doing that full time, studying again. So I'm basically a theorist, I guess, if you even want to say something like that, but I don't use quantitative methods. I know we're going to get into that in a little bit, but I just read a lot and I try to write some theory, and that's been really gratifying. And I look forward to hearing from everybody else and the questions they have in their own life path and journey as I study identity development in the transition to motherhood. Okay.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. I think it's so great to hear about how you transitioned from an undergraduate at Barnard. I know we have a lot of psych majors here and some people who are thinking about being psych majors. So hearing about how that tied in. And also for a lot of you, it sounds like psychology wasn't necessarily your first love upon arriving at Barnard, but that once you found us, that was how you found your direction and your path. So that's fantastic. So I'd like to start by thinking about what are some of the things that you feel are kind of the essential pieces for you in either your clinical practice or in the research that you're doing. So, you know, what is it you need to have in order to be good at what you do? What is it that makes you a good clinical psychologist? And I'll just let any of our panelists jump on in.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, thank you. So it kind of reminds me of when I was writing my internship application essay for all of us who survived that. That's basically what you have to do when you're, it's essentially like a one-year residency for those of you who don't know about that part of the career yet. And I kind of wrote about how initially when I thought about being a therapist, I thought about like my innate quality of like wanting to make other people happy. And like side note, everyone, my mom is in the audience, so she can probably attest to that, ever since I was little. And what I realized is that's actually really not what being a therapist is. In fact, it's actually being really good at making people uncomfortable for the sake of their like greater life happiness. Like if you think about exposure therapy, for example, which is all about having people face their fears in order to get over the fears, that's actually quite uncomfortable, right? It's not about making people happy in the moment. So I think that, you know, when thinking about like what makes me, you know, a good clinician, it's knowing that like the long game, knowing that eventually I can help people like reach their goals and feel more fulfilled, feel more gratified or more happiness overall. And whenever someone says to me, I want to feel happier, I'm like, what does that even mean? You're always going to be chasing happiness. Like, tell me what concretely happiness looks like for you. So I think it's a lot of patience to get there, and like tolerating discomfort in other people, because I would say that's majority of my day.
Catherine, you were going to jump in. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, so I think that the competency that benefits my my professional success is really a paradoxical one, in that it's about understanding what we don't know and can't know. So everything, I don't have a clinical orientation other than I am scientifically oriented, in that the research continually evolves about which treatments are front runners relative to others for specific disorders and populations. And I go wherever the research tells me to go and gain the expertise in what I need to serve the populations that I specialize in. And there's a lot of humility in that. And what I mean by that is even treatments that are those gold standard interventions, they are not cure-alls for everybody. And research has not been able to answer what works best for whom because of a lot of methodological challenges in that. And so I'm always using my knowledge of cognitive psychology to call myself on my own biases, our tendency to confirmation bias, for instance. If I start with a diagnostic hypothesis, I'm going to then try to cull information from a patient to support that hypothesis. So I have to always remind myself to ask the same broad range of questions to everybody, and not draw conclusions and foreclose my ideas prematurely. So, so I think that is, you know, kind of also knowing what I don't know keeps me passionate about research that continues to fill in the jigsaw puzzle of a lot of mysterious disorders. I work and research primarily anorexia nervosa, which is a challenging disorder for the field, both clinically and to understand it phenomenologically. And so I think that the spirit of lifelong learning and knowing that what I learned in graduate school has long ago expired and I have to keep learning has, I think, served my profession the best.
Terrific, thank you. I love that. Yeah, it is really a lifelong learning process, isn't it? Gina.
Yeah, so yeah, I do mostly hands-on work with clients, and I would say the biggest, I think, a strength that you can bring in my experience and working clinically with people is to have the ability to engage with a wide variety of people, to help people feel comfortable, and be kind of nuanced at building trust, building rapport. And I like to do that in a way, like I try to put people at ease. I try to tell them you don't have to share more than you're comfortable when we are starting out, because I feel like the relationship is the foundation for all the work that you do later on. And I also like to take the approach of letting my clients teach me about themselves. So, you know, for example, if I studied African-American psychology or something like that, and then I have an African-American client, like, I don't want to just be like, oh, okay, textbook, like, all right, these are your issues probably. Like, I like want to know when to bring that in and when to put that on the back burner, essentially. And I feel like clients are the best experts when it comes to how they identify and their lives and their problems. And so I really kind of try to make it a very collaborative experience. And one other thing that comes up a lot, at least, you know, previously with my work, especially in the schools, is crisis management. So that's a big part of, like, you know, working with certain populations. So helping people create safety plans if they are feeling like suicidal or they're engaging in self-harming behaviors. And then also submitting child abuse reports. Like, you know, that's a part of the responsibility as a mandated reporter. So kind of like having to navigate these situations with people that can be uncomfortable, but trying to know how to put them at ease and walk them through and like let them know what to expect, and making sure that they know that you have their best interests at heart has been a really big keystone for me.
Fantastic. That sounds like a real challenge, especially working with kids who may be entering the system.
Absolutely. Totally.
Terrific. Thank you. Aurelie.
Well, it's hard to build, you know, I'm just going to build on what everybody else said. I think it's a combination of maybe the overarching theme is openness and curiosity. Those are really good stances to have, and to like people. I think that's a pretty good starter. I fundamentally believe in the self-awareness of people, that they can get there if supported and cared for, and tap into their own inner resources and external support systems. If they have someone to witness them and really see them and believe in them. So I have that openness and curiosity to know who they are and where they're trying to go, and to really listen to the deeper register of where that's going. And I think that's the same thing even in research. I think some of the students that I've really enjoyed working with, and the qualities that they've had too, was that kind of openness and the ability to follow an inquiry process, an open-ended, not knowing where it's going to go. There is no answer in a textbook, and to really kind of follow moment to moment what the information is guiding, and to stay very close to that, and to always check in both with the data and or the person you're working with to see if that feels and rings true to them. So yeah, checking your bias,
Okay.
your authority. That's how we do it.
So I think that ties into a question that is always been of a lot of interest to me, which is when you're in a room and you're working one-on-one with another individual, or even if you're working with a couple or with a family unit, you're bringing yourself into that room. So how is your identity, how does your identity, both the visible identity, but also your invisible identities, how does that affect or influence or inform your practice? And Arlie, we started with you. We were last on there, so if you want to, you can be first up on this one.
Sure. I just like to be an object of projection. That might actually speak to the psychoanalytic stance that I have, meaning that, whoever I look visibly or invisibly, people are going to imbue that with meaning and meaning for them. So I get really curious about who they think my identities are and what that means for them. And I also am very curious about their identities and how it shapes their experience in the world. I'm particularly interested in invisible identities as well, because I write on reproductive identity, and that's a space where we often don't see that visibly. So I think before we name or categorize, I really like to really hear how a person thinks of who they are and who they think I am, and go from there.
Great, great. Gina, you were mentioning a little bit about identities in your work with people with diverse cultures. Could you speak to that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So I am someone who identifies as mixed. My mother is Chinese American and my father's African American. So I grew up in a multicultural family, and multiculturalism was really important to me as I transitioned into graduate school. And I actually attended the California School of Professional Psychology in San Francisco, and their kind of focus, their like brand basically is multiculturalism. Like they want all of their clinicians to be culturally competent. So I felt like that was a good match for me. In terms of my theoretical orientation, I integrate different kinds, but my foundational one is multiculturalism, basically. So I like really do bring culture into the mix. I feel like culture is the foundation on which many people experience the world, experience themselves. And I tell people that, and I tell people, like, I want you to teach me about how do you identify, and how does that impact the issues that we'll be working on in therapy. And I also have a non-apparent disability, which is stuttering. And I feel like, I kind of share that with clients when I feel like it might be helpful to share. I feel like sometimes that is something that can, interestingly be a interesting point of connection sometimes. And then I also have found that a lot of clients or prospective clients are looking for clinicians of color to work with. They just kind of are like seeking that out. More and more, I see more and more of that. So I feel like that's been helpful for me. They want to talk about their, cultural experiences, and I guess it kind of creates a sense of a safety for that. So that's been helpful too.
Fantastic. Catherine or Tully, you want to jump in on this one too?
Sure. I think that self-disclosure about identity or aspects of personal life in clinical encounters is often understood, at least by the public, as being fairly concrete. Like, do you answer your patient's questions, or more focus on what their ideas are about you? But there's so much that we communicate in nonverbal indicators, whether it's the taste and the possible amount of socioeconomic power behind your taste, to indicators of religious identity or partnered status, or and the list goes on. And I find that because communication about anything about the clinical psychologist should always be in the interest of the patient, first and foremost. that I find myself revealing different things depending on the circumstances. And sometimes I do that proactively, and sometimes I do that reactively, meaning in response to a question. Purposes may include normalization, reducing a defensiveness. I work with a lot of families around various parenting issues, and sometimes conveying some camaraderie of, oh, we all have moments we wish we could take back as parents. It allows the person to then be more honest with you and trust, whereas there are other patients, even some families that I may see, where that would not be helpful to them. So I think I look very different in how, to the extent that I can control my communication of my identities, I think it varies so much in my caseload.
Yeah, the only thing that I can really add above and beyond those things is, so one of the core, I guess, ideas in DBT, this therapy that I mentioned I specialize in, is this idea of being radically genuine, which basically gives a therapist permission to really be themselves. And as you see me today, that's really how I am with my patients. Maybe a little bit more professional, let's be honest, but really I'm myself, right? So I have pictures of my kids on my desk. I talk about my identity. I talk about the fact that I'm Jewish. I talk about the fact that I observe, the different levels that go along with being Jewish, the holidays, the Sabbath, all of that. I talk about being a mom. I talk about being a sister, a daughter, a husband, sorry, a wife. I was thinking about my husband as I said that. A wife, right? A friend, all of those things, because I think Catherine, to your point, right? It makes you a lot more relatable and like a human, at least in my perspective. And for example, during the pandemic, I was working with an older man, like a man in his 60s, who was kind of telling me how difficult it was to be around his family all the time. He has a really hard time asserting himself with his wife. And I said to him, I was like, listen, you and I, we're gonna meet 2 a.m. outside our houses, and we're both gonna run away from our families. I get it. Being with your family all the time is so hard, right? So this idea of just being myself, even in that comment, was giving him so much information that I have a family that's normal enough that would drive me crazy in a pandemic. So really the permission to be myself, own my identities, is a huge part of what I do. And I think hopefully makes me more relatable to people.
Thank you.
Can I add one little thing?
Absolutely.
Identity. So COVID related. So in the world of telehealth, which I've been engaged in, especially because I still have some patients back east, and I had to think about whether I was going to put my pronouns in my Zoom name, which you probably see there. And even though not all my patients would really understand its significance, so it might confuse some of them who are from backgrounds where that's not part of the vocabulary. But I decided that from an ethical framework, decided it was more, especially as a cisgender person, more important. The benefits to me outweighed the potential disadvantages, and I figured I could always address questions. But it's little moment. One of the things I love about being a psychologist is that every little moment is interesting because we have the tools to think so multidimensionally about every decision, and only to the extent that it's kind of fun or useful. It's not about driving people crazy with it, hopefully.
But I think that brings up a great point. And Gina, you touched on this also when you talked about the training that California School of Professional Psychology, is that it? That it was so much emphasis on cultural diversity and cultural competency. And I know that's become something that is very important in psychology. We hear a lot about this. I know when I was on my internship, there was a lot of discussion about cultural competency and how to attain cultural competency, which really brings up kind of underscores the fact that psychology as a profession has tended to be very white. And so what ways you either work towards cultural competency yourself, or does the work environment where you are work on issues around diversity and inclusion? How do you deal with that in sessions? How do you deal with that in your workplace? Whoever wants to jump in.
I can go. So obviously I'm white, and I work in a practice that is primarily, white staffed, and we serve a really high SES clientele, for better or worse. And we talk a lot about, what that means for our diversity and our multiculturalism, as well as, like, to your point, the idea that we are striving for like multicultural competency and how to like uphold that value that we have. And it's tricky because our staff is all white. We work with really affluent, mostly non-diverse population. And so some of the ways that we've tried, or I think my practice, right? So I'm kind of speaking on behalf of the group. We are in the process of developing a nonprofit that would allow us to provide services as well as trainings for in a more diverse, multicultural way to kind of uphold that value, because we know we haven't been, let's call it out, right? We know we haven't been, we know that we're serving non-diverse populations and we really want to. And there's reasons, why it's not happening. So kind of to help with that, we're navigating that by trying to pull for trainees who are like, more diverse trainee population, because we also run a training program. So like what would attract a more diverse training class? And then how can we also service more diverse clientele by having, some reduced fee or more access? So one of the things that we do also is provide school consultations. And we've been trying to get into schools also that serve a lower SES community to kind of help provide needs in that way. So it is not where it needs to be, and we're working on it.
There's that DBT dialectic for you right there.
Unescapable, yeah.
I can go next. So I would say that, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's kind of going through a moment, I would say right now. And in my experience working at county, so I was on the front lines, basically, like working in the schools with other therapists, with other people who are training to be therapists, with health educators, things like that. And I would say that the most diversity I found was on the front lines, like people like me who were trying to work with the kids. And the kids at my school, so I worked at a junior high school for 5 years, and it was 1,000 kids, and I would say 90% of them were Latinx, and about 10% were African American. So, and a lot came from like out of the country, newcomers to the States, and a lot of poverty, a lot of trauma. And I think it was interesting because at county, we were on the front lines and it was pretty diverse, but the upper management was largely white. And so I really saw that, and I feel like the upper management, the supervisors, the systems really should be a little more like integrated, I think, and open to hearing what the people on the front lines have to say, because they're like serving the populations that, for example, the county is trying to serve. And I think also one thing that you do see in more like diverse client base is the lack of trust in the medical system, for example, or in the whole therapy process. Like a lot of people do not trust doctors, and they have legit reasons not to based on historical things. So kind of like walking that line between serving county, but also serving the people and trying to put them at ease, and trying to make yourself somebody that they can trust. Like that is certainly like it takes some kind of like nuancing, finessing. So yeah, I think that interestingly, with like telehealth and stuff like that, it's been like much more access to therapy has been created out of it. And I think people from more backgrounds can seek therapy. It's being more like normalized. It's being more of something that, you know, lots of different groups do. And I think that's been a really positive thing. And it's just more accessible for a lot more people, which has been a positive thing and kind of something that I feel like the pandemic expedited in terms of a change in our field.
Thank you.
I'm happy to say a few words too. I was really thinking about it, and I was thinking about the time when I was a trainee and how like multicultural competence was maybe like one module, you know, maybe a class if you were lucky. And certainly the teaching staff, right, was largely white. And things have evolved, and like we said, have to continue to evolve. But we know that it has to be in the water fully, right? So when I was developing curriculum and hiring and constructing programming, it was from the ground up and from, you know, the up down. So meaning, you know, thinking about reviewing syllabi and where are the readings coming from, where are the, that's really important. So, right, so qualitative methods outside the field of psychology, anthropology, really kind of bringing in different voices. I really like the idea of voice. And then the staff itself, and then the student body, and so on and so forth. And in the community, really just having diversity be something that we live and breathe, because we do. The world is diverse, and so you can no longer sit back and say you didn't know that. So that imperative and that real sort of calling to do that work is at least becoming more centered and more central and more important. And I also think that what's cool about where we are today is that psychology has mainstreamed as a whole, so that we can use the tools of psychological science to bring you know, people's awareness and consciousness about their own biases, you know, just out in the world. Like the other day I was on a call with someone who was just working in tech, and they're saying, oh, you know, they're going to have this free implicit bias training for all their staff. And I thought to myself, my goodness, you know, like that's a term that's just on the street being used. You know, that's not something that even a decade ago. And, you know, at TC, we have just phenomenal minds, thinkers, you know, who've been foundational theorists of a lot of this within the counseling program. So at least we're, you know, it's been such a pleasure to work in a university which, you know, embodies that and teaches it. Just even, like I said, it's in the water. So I'm really happy that now I get a hand to do that in a different way, meaning now I bring those medical professionals that Gina talked about. So I do reproductive health, and we know the mortality rates of women of color, and what is that about, bringing in people from OBGYN and other medical professions to come in and start to do their own inner work. So we can actually reach out and actually do something about it, put people through a psychological experience to reflect and build their competence. So that's cool. I think that's a neat part of my job today from where I started.
Terrific. Thank you. And I like hearing where people kind of feel like the field is going in the future. And I'm glad to see that, and glad to hear that there is a lot of effort, not just in terms of training programs, but in diversity and some concrete ideas on how to increase our cultural competency in that way. So I've invited the guests, all of the students here, to put any questions that they have in the chat, and I will kind of read those out as they come in. But maybe we could start with a question that's probably near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, which is what advice, well, actually there's a question in the chat, so we'll take this first, and then I'll let you kind of think on this as we're going through, but it will finish up maybe with the question of what advice would you give somebody who wants to enter the field? But Lisa Scholleman has asked a question. I'm wondering what you learned at Barnard that led you into clinical psych. What experiences influenced your decision? I'm just going to go out on a limb and say it's the amazing faculty in psychology, but
Well, for me, it was actually because I think probably the person who may have done the clinical coursework right before you, because I know she was there for a while. I was actually originally thinking of doing a PhD in social psychology, not clinical psychology. And taking that class, that field work class, gave me exposure that leaned me more in a clinical direction. And then my advisor in the department knew of my double major and had heard about a volunteer opportunity at Columbia's eating disorders program. And she said, I think you might really like this, working in this area as kind of a bridge between your wanting to be a scientist within psychology, and also your women's studies framework. And so I applied for and got that volunteer position, and that launched me into a career of working with this field. And so I think that mentors from Barnard through my fellowship have been hugely influential, and I am grateful to Barnard for starting that.
okay. So another question came in. What was the hardest part of the graduate school application process, as well as the hardest part of your time in graduate school?
There's always something else. Every time you think you're done, there's like another hoop you have to jump through until you're like really, really done. So I think that like what feels like a never ending journey is really hard. I would say like specific milestones that are really challenging are applying for internship, your dissertation, and like your licensing exam. For me, those were the three most challenging things that I had to do, and the most time and like draining. And then I promise once you're done, you're really done. You don't have to do anything else once you get licensed.
Wait, no. We have our continuing education.
Yeah, that's right. Continuing
now.
But like you don't have to like study. There's more money you have to spend.
Every time I write a grant or a paper, I think, why am I inflicting this upon myself? It feels like you're constantly in graduate school getting graded. So.
I'd like to say, I think the hardest part of grad school for me was my second year. So my program was 4 years. And the second year, just balancing all of the work, like dissertation, psychological testing, which you have to give people full psychological, batteries. And then also doing a clinical practicum at the same time for 16, 20 hours a week. So all the school, and then all of the training, and all of the presentations that go with the training, and all the papers you have to write for training. Like, I think that was the hardest part, my second year. It just really kind of picked up. But yeah, I would say that was the most challenging part about graduate school for me. And then, like a licensure, took a long time. You have to take 2 tests here in California. And I studied, I think, all in all, about 6 months. But yeah, those are probably the most challenging parts for me.
So a couple of questions have come in about, and I get this question a lot too from students who are interested, what's the difference between a PsyD and a PhD? And is it really true that if you do a PsyD, you don't have to do research?
I could just speak about the PsyD. So when I was in Barnard, I was actually steered away from going the PhD route, which now I don't even totally understand or remember why. So I ended up applying to like all the local meaning like tri-state PsyD programs, got into a bunch and ended up choosing LIU. In my PsyD program, you obviously have to do a dissertation, which could involve quantitative research or qualitative research. So they're not as like rigid about that. Beyond that, and taking a research methods course and statistics course, you don't have to do other research. I obviously elected to do a lot of research, and that like kind of like led me to like this amazing part of my career, which I love, being able to like lead research projects. And so in a PsyD route, you don't have to do so much research, and you still have to do enough to kind of like get through the program. So if you're like scared of math or numbers, and you'll have a little bit of exposure to it, but like you don't have to spend your whole life, your whole career or time in this ID program in a lab doing research, that kind of thing. And my research in my program was all clinical based. So like studying interventions, that kind of thing, not in a lab.
Yeah, to add to that, yeah, so I also pursued the PsyD, and actually, so when I was at Barnard and I graduated in 2007, there was only one class that kind of focused on clinical psychology, and it was called Intro to Clinical Psychology. And I liked that one the best. You know, like at the school, there was a lot of focus on, you know, science, research, you know, theory, which was cool because that was foundational. But then what I did between my junior and senior year of college is I contacted a bunch of clinics in my area because I was coming back to San Francisco for the summer. And I just kind of emailed people and was like, hey, do you guys need an intern for the summer? I want to work in a clinic and, you know, talk to people there. And, you know, I am considering going to grad school, things like that. And so that was actually the turning point for me, because I got to meet a lot of current grad students in both PhD and PsyD programs. And kind of based on talking to them, I would take them out for lunch and stuff like that. And like, you know, talking to them, that's what made me want to pursue the PsyD, because it seemed like I was most interested and passionate about hands-on clinical work with people. So yeah, but yes, you do still have to write a dissertation. I had to do that, had to take stats, had to run stats. And yeah, with the PsyD, you can have a kind of more like qualitative like dissertation, at least with my program. They were like, you know, if you want, your dissertation can be to write a children's book about a mental health issue or something like that. But because I'm masochistic, I decided to do a full-on, you know, quantitative study basically. But yeah, you do still absolutely have to still do research.
So a question that I think would be great for those of you who are a little bit more academic focused, if you have a PhD but are more inclined towards practice, how do you balance your research commitments? And after receiving your doctorate, what are the expectations in terms of research academia? So in other words, how do you do work-life balance when you're doing research and clinical work and, in theory, having a life outside of that?
I'd love to answer that one. I think it starts before even talking about the hardest part, even in your doctoral program, is that it doesn't become all consuming. You know, it's a marathon, it's a long time. You're going to commit 5 to 7 years. You may not be bringing some income. You have relationships to also foster. You have to think about if, again, maybe even family matters if you're going to do that, and that's not always supported on the way in. So you almost have to create a culture for yourself about where do you place your time. And the magic of PhD and PsyD is that you can wear many hats, and that's the beautiful the beautiful thing about a PhD or a PsyD, is that you can work in so many different sectors, sometimes even all at the same time. And so you have to start making sort of decisions, and you can also do that over the entire lifespan, right? You can have many chapters, and we even see that embodied in some of the panelists and how you're doing that. So I think it's a matter of, maybe it's an 80-20 principle. You might be working predominantly in one area, like doing your research or administration in academia, but I have one day a week where I have a private practice and I hold a load, because I think it's really important also the way they inform each other, right? You want to see the material come live in your clients and your patients, and then you want to bring it back, or vice versa. I love folks who are, you know, full-time clinical practice who also fold in some kind of research or reading, even if that's just a reading group. But it can actually be quite challenging. You can very easily work 12 hours a day easily in doing this, regardless of what you do. And so having good boundaries around work, especially because anyone who comes into this field must love it very much in order to have this lifelong curiosity in doing the work. And so, you have to really put those boundaries down and finish up. You can also, clients can see you late at night or early in the morning. You really have to kind of think about where you want to place your time. Last thing I wanted to say too is that the general public often doesn't know very much difference between PsyD or PhD, right? They're not always as educated consumers as you are going into training yourself. So at the end, many of us are doing very similar things, including counseling psychologists. We work in the same settings in hospital care, and there are also many gateways to the mental health professions. When I do advisement, we might be focusing on PhD and PsyD, but I think it's important to also say that even again, since I was trained, the LMHC has been opened up. We have the licensed psychoanalyst in New York State, at least. There are, social work, obviously, kind of more classic pathways. There's so many ways to do this work. So, really think about where you want to put your energies. If you're really enjoying sitting with a person and doing psychotherapy, that's what I often put in front of students as well. Is the PhD track the way you want to go? Or also, what are the lenses? There's so many ways that you get trained, from cognitive behavioral to, I mentioned, psychoanalytics. So looking at programs, all of that is there. So it's, there's a lot more nuance to the path. A lot of times when you're starting out, you just see the PhD program, and then you really have to kind of navigate. I love what Gina says, just talk to a lot of people and see who you want to be in the world and what sounds like the kind of life you want to live, and what pathways did they get there to do that. And it could be very multiple pathways too. They can get there in very creative ways.
I want to just add that whatever decisions you make, and often doing some kind of work in the field, after between college and graduate school, is really important in both building your CV and also checking in about what aspect of the profession you want. When you do decide, and this goes also back to a question about what was the hardest part of the graduate school application process. Having sat on done admissions to a PhD program for years, I can say that the essay is going to be critical. It's probably the hardest part of your application, and it's also one of the most important. And being defined in how you understand yourself. So if you do decide, for example, to apply to, let's say, a PhD program, you would want to speak to why that degree is right for you, as opposed to that you're sort of casting a wide net, and wherever you get in, you get in. And to really have to write an essay that helps the reader understand who you are as different from all the other applicants. Even if the stories and professional backgrounds are similar, what really defines you and how you envision yourself in this career, and why do you want that particular degree?
Fantastic. I think that, I'm sure everybody really appreciates these insights, especially around some of that application process and the different types of degrees that kind of get you to the same place in terms of working with people. And I get a lot of questions about that also when I'm talking with students. But I know that we're getting, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, just that just saying in an essay that you want to help people is both inadequate and may make you appear naive in terms of what this field is about. Because to Tali's point, my colleagues and I laugh about at places that describe their practices as being a safe place. And we joke that we create a very unsafe place where you're going to be really uncomfortable and not necessarily feel better, but you're going to get better and you'll be much happier at the end. So you want to sound like you have a sophisticated understanding of what you're getting into, factoring in everything Tali said at the beginning.
So as we wind up, and Gina, I know you have a patient, so you may have to pop off, but I did have a question about balancing emotions, right? Because depending on the kind of work you do, I know I work with trauma survivors. I'm also a DBT therapist, so I'm dealing with people who are highly suicidal or at risk for self-harm. So how do you balance the emotions that are in that room? How do you keep yourself separate? How do you engage in self-care? And how do you keep from burnout in order to be able to do this work and be present for people who are suffering so much?
One one form of self-care that I noticed is that the more I advanced in my career and accumulated kind of that bank of people's stories, you hear people's stories, and a lot of them are traumatic, is that my tolerance, and I'm a big reader, and I used to read anything and everything that was hopefully good. And I became unable to, no matter how acclaimed a novel that is, that I can't both have it in my downtime and in my work time. So I had to really kind of change my outer world and how much contact I make with suffering and in my free time with my pleasure reading, in order to have the strength to really not to really tolerate it in a way that's empathic with the patient.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I sometimes when I would go on interviews over the course of my career, people would say, like, how do you do self-care? And like, I would like always be like, oh, like I go to the gym. And now I'm like, I hate going to the gym. Like, that's not what I do for self-care. Although sometimes I run and it does feel good. But I think that the idea is, like, for me at least, is I really appreciate what you just said, Catherine, about like over time, you kind of like accumulate a threshold or a tolerance about like what you can handle. And I see the more confident I become, over the course of my training and my career, the less I'm kind of like going to sleep thinking about my clients. Obviously, I care about them so much. And the ability to, like, over time, like put it in another box, and like, I'll think about it when I think about it, or I'll think about it when I see them next. And otherwise you're just, in addition to carrying around your own pain, you're also carrying around potentially 20 other people's pain, and that is way too much for any human to bear. So developing strategies or skills that help you like shut it down. So, or kind of like put it away briefly, right? And then when you want it to come back up, it can. So I'm a big binge watcher. I've probably watched all the shows that you have this week. So that is like a huge way. And like, also, like, I no longer can like sit and watch like 20 episodes of SVU. It's just too much pain in one day. So kind of like opposite to the emotion that I might be feeling. And making sure I have things in my life, in my week, that I'm looking forward to and bring me joy. That is really important. Even if it's something like, last night I got home really late and I was like, I'm gonna go into my son's room and like kiss him goodnight, because like I know that will make me feel good. And like that was like that one little thing last night that like sparked me joy. So making sure I have those things that can generate those positive emotions, because this work is really draining and can feel really emotionally overwhelming at times. So making sure you have that.
Yeah, those are, I can relate to both very, very strongly. And I think the only thing I want to add is that it not only depletes, but there's something about being with someone in the moment, with them, during that time, that gives back to me as well. I am very fulfilled by being in such tough places with people. You often hear, honesty that you don't hear in your daily life. You hear regret, you hear redemption, you hear all sorts of things. It's really, in fact, it's at times the most alive I can also feel, without, making it a Pollyanna thing. There are very tough things that you hear and you do have to put away. As you say, I find nature incredibly restorative, only because I think it's just in the fabric. Resilience is all around. You see a stump and you see something growing out of it. You know, you just have to remember that recovery and resilience is built into the natural system, the natural world, and we're part of it. And there you have it. So.
Sorry, one last thing I wanted to add that I just thought of is also like having a network or a team of colleagues that can validate how you're feeling, because I do think that we're a really unique field. I always find myself like jealous of like accountants who like don't have to deal with other humans, in my mind at least. But like I have friends from grad school. Obviously, I work in a big practice as part of a team. That's like a huge part of DBT. So having that like camaraderie and understanding and built-in network of validation is so helpful to my job.
And also supervision groups, your own therapy, you have to circulate this somewhere. And I think that's right. Don't go it alone.
So as we finish up, and I'm sure everybody joins me in thanking the panelists for this. So just in closing, is there one piece of advice you could offer your fellow Barnard students in terms of what would be helpful to them in seeking out a career in clinical psychology, or what is the piece of information you wish you had known as an undergraduate that might have helped you along your way with this? What piece of advice would you offer the current Barnard students? Too much advice to just pick one thing, right?
I feel like the people in this room are doing what I would say already, is like taking advantage of the opportunities that the college has to offer. I don't remember going to something like this when I was in undergrad, and it would have been so helpful. So I think any opportunity you have to learn more about the field and get hands-on experience, because it can be hard when you're not in graduate school. It, first of all, resume booster, but also gives you more of a, you know, understanding and exposure to what you would possibly be doing.
Oh, I have a good one too. Like, don't impoverish yourself. Shop around. You know, the getting into schools, you know, on the coasts that are highly competitive, that sometimes don't have any scholarship funding or anything like that. Yes, of course, there's a reason why you might want to go there, for some of the obvious reasons, or because there's a mentor there that you want to work with. But at the end, all roads lead to Rome. And I do want to say that you have your life to support as well. And to think about, one thing they don't even teach you in grad school is even just how to start a business. On the other side of psychology, starting private practices or learning how to publish books or whatever it is to really be a real person with economic self-sufficiency. It's not only a philosophical calling and contribution and service to the world, but how to support yourself. So I find that a lot of times with students, they're willing to, you know, pay out of pocket, and I really want them to find programs that invest in them too, through scholarship and through true mentoring. Find mentoring either in the program itself or through the professor who you know will invest in you and really teach you how to move up through the next part of your career as well, so you don't kind of launch without a safety net.
A piece of advice I'd like to give is, even if you have always been passionate about clinical psychology, cherish every class you're taking as a psych major, because all of the different branches of psychological science converge and inform clinical psychology, whether it's the methodology of testing clinical interventions or understanding some core learning theory principles as they play out in the development of psychopathology. I wish I had even though clinical psychology was not my first interest, I remember not really appreciating the range of classes and wanting to just focus on what I was interested in. And And I use so much from the broader field of psychology all the time.
Okay, so I want to thank all of you for coming, for sharing your insights, for sharing your experiences with all of the Barnard students. I had a couple of requests. If you would feel comfortable sharing your email address, if you would be comfortable with students contacting you, feel free to put your email in the chat. It's been absolutely fabulous having you here, and just such a range of careers in psychology and in clinical psychology, being able to take what seems like, oh, well, it's a major, it's a psych major, and take it in so many fascinating directions. And we really appreciate you taking the time to come back to speak to the next generation of clinical psychologists. And thank you. Thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining, everyone. So that concludes our program. I'll hang tight if you all want to copy down their email addresses. But again, panelists, thank you so much. And have a great evening, everyone. Thank you. Kathleen, thank you so much for moderating.
You're welcome.
Can I play a little network geography while people are signing off? Because Aurelia, it hit me why your name is familiar. You must know